Okay, welcome everyone. In this video, I want to talk about how we can override the default stat for Geom. So in particular, let's suppose we are working with the Geom bar. We're constructing a bar plot in ggplot2. And the bar plot that we constructed in the previous video was a basic bar plot of the penguins data frame, where we were constructing a bar plot for the counts of species. So here we were plotting the count, how many observations in the penguins data frame were Adelie, how many were chinstrap, how many were Gen2 species. So the default geom for the geom bar, or excuse me, the default statistical transformation, the default stat for geom bar is counts. So by default, it displayed counts on the vertical axis, on the y-axis. But sometimes we might want to display a different stat argument on than the default. And so let's kind of first think about how we could display counts with the identity. And you might think like, why am I going to do this in a different way? And I just want to kind of illustrate this first method because it's going to give us a way of really customizing things to displaying any sort of count that we want to. So let's think about calculating the counts for species in the following way. So here is a code cell that's going to do the following. So this first command is going to construct a table. So what this command does is it goes into the penguins data frame, looks at the species variable, and it's going to count how many observations are from each species. And then it's going to convert that table to a data frame. And we'll print that data frame to this screen in a moment so you see what it looks like. And that data frame is not going to have any names for the columns. It's going to have like default names that are not very descriptive. So after I create this data frame that I'm going to call penguins count, I'm going to give it each of those columns is going to have two columns. The first column is going to have information about the species name, and the second column is going to have the number of observations, the count for each of the species. I'm going to name that column count, and then we'll print the resulting data frame to the screen. So you can see what this data frame looks like. It's a data frame with 3 observations, 3 rows and 2 columns. So the first row is Adelie. There's 151 observations, chinstrap 68, Gen2 123. And so now we can create a bar plot from this really basic looking data frame. So basically now we did the statistical transformation that ggplot2 does when it creates the bar plot. It does this table and then does the plot. So we're kind of doing these steps ourselves now. So now we're going to create a plot from penguins count. And now we're going to map the aesthetics ourselves. So we're going to map species to X, just like we did up here. And we're now going to say, you're not going to tell me what to map on the y-axis. I'm not going to let you decide what to put on y. I'm telling you what the counts are. You're going to put y count. So this is what you're going to put on the y-axis. And now in the geom bar layer, I need to tell ggplot2 override your default stat transformation. So the default stat transformation is that it's going to do the statistical transformation of counting things and then plotting these things. And I'm telling it, I've already done it. I've counted things up and I've stored those counts into a column that I've called count that I'm telling you to plot on the y-axis. So all I'm telling you to do is use the statistical transformation called the identity, which says just take the values that I'm telling you to plot that are in the y aesthetic. And this is going to create the same exact plot that we had above. So all I've done here is I did the counting myself. So I did the statistical transformation that R does by default. I stored those counts into a data frame called penguins count, where the counts are stored in a variable that I called count. So then I mapped those counts to the Y aesthetic. And then I told ggplot, don't use your default stat transformation. Instead, use the counts that I mapped to Y. So use the stat identity. And voila. So this is like not how you would create a bar plot of counts, because this is a much more direct way of doing that. You don't have to count the tables, but this is a nice method for doing it because we can customize this and extend this to calculate things besides the count. So over here, I could calculate just about anything and put it in this column over here. So if instead of doing counts, let's say I wanted to calculate percentages, right? And so on this axis, on this vertical axis, I wanted to calculate out of all of the observations in the penguins data frame, what percentage of the penguins were Adelie, what percentage were chinstrap, what percentage were Gen 2. Instead of calculating the counts over here, I could convert each of these to a percentage. There are lots of ways that you could compute those to a percentage. So one way that I could do that is I can take the table that I had before, which was all of these values over here. This command prop table, in case you're curious what it does, it converts those counts to proportions. So what that function does is it takes 151 plus 68 plus 123. It calculates a grand total and then takes 151, divides it by the grand total, takes 68, divides it by the grand total, takes 123, divides it by the grand total. So it converts each of these counts to a proportion out of the grand total. And if I want to display proportions, I'm just going to convert, percentages. I'm just going to convert those proportions to percent by multiplying by 100. And I'm going to construct a similar data frame that I call penguins percent. But now this column, instead of having counts, it has percentages. And so now when I create my bar plot, I'm going to call in the data frame penguins percent. I'm going to call in species. I'm going to map species to the X aesthetic. I'm going to map the percentage column to the Y aesthetic. And then I need to tell ggplot not to use the default stat in Geom bar, but use the identity stat so that you plot the percentages that it gets from that column. And the plot looks almost identical to the one that we had above. The heights are the same relative to each other. The only difference is the units of what's being plotted on the vertical axis. So now we're plotting a percentage as opposed to counts. So that's a nice way of overriding the default stat transformation. We can calculate our own statistic stored into a data frame or add it to the data frame that we started with, and then force it into the plot using the stat identity. And I also just want to remind you that in the previous module, we did construct we did convert the counts on a bar plot to proportions using a different method, which was using the after stat method, where there are some additional statistical transformations that R can calculate by default. So, for example, ggplot can do a statistical transformation for proportion. So just like it can, the default statistical transformation is to do counts. It is equipped to do a proportion calculation. You can see over here, it did calculate proportions. It's very similar to the one over here, just fine. But these after stat transformations are limited. You can't do anything that you want. This process over here is really unlimited. You could calculate anything that you want and then plot anything that you want on this axis over here. Okay, so that's all I want to talk about as far as statistical transformations. Next, we'll move on and talk about constructing stacked and clustered bar plots in ggplot2. Thanks.